Hey everybody, let's check out this game by the great attacking player Alexander Alekhine. So Alekhine had the white pieces in this game. His opponent was Ollesevich, and this was apparently a correspondence game, which makes it that much more interesting, that the players had a lot of time to think, and that Alekhine still played this swashbuckling, smashing attack. So he began the game with e4, and his opponent played e5, and he went for the king's gambit with the move f4. His opponent took the pawn, and after knight f3, played g5, probably the most testing move back then and still today. h4 was Alekhine's response, and his opponent pushed. Taking this pawn would not make very much sense from black's point of view. White could just respond with d4, and the knight is safe here. White would own the center. Bishop takes pawn is coming. Bishop c4 is coming. White would be very happy after pawn takes pawn. And so black pushed to disturb the natural placement of white's knight on f3. Alekhine jumps to e5 with his knight. And here the knight is doing a few different things in the center of the board. It's eyeing the f7 square. It's also looking at maybe coming like a rubber band back around to capture on g4, depending on how black responds. And so black's response, h5, is intended to guard this pawn, to prevent knight takes. Alekhine now played bishop c4, attacking this f7 pawn with both minor pieces, and giving black a little bit of a dilemma. Here, black decides to play the move rook h7 to defend with the rook. I guess it also would have been possible to consider something like knight h6 to defend. But rook h7 is logical enough, and of course black was probably not going to castle anyway, so there's no harm in moving the rook to defend there. Now Alekhine plays the move d4, consistent with the king's gambit, just controlling the center. And here black plays a move that it looks quite logical, but gives white a big advantage. He plays this move queen h6. A couple things that are not great about this move. One, it's going to occupy this f file that white is likely going to crash through. Once Alekhine castles, his rook will be on the f file, and already he has pieces galore pointed at f7, so placing the queen on f6 is kind of like putting the queen in what will be the line of fire. Black did have another interesting move here that is a little subtle. It's this idea f3, which it doesn't make a lot of sense unless you think, okay, d6 is a move that normally is played in the king's gambit, right? When the knight gets to e5 to kick this knight away. But here, after like bishop takes f7, and let's say rook takes f7, knight takes f7, king takes f7, white can play bishop takes f4 when the threat of maybe castling with the rook on the open f file is very strong. And so this very subtle idea of pushing this pawn to f3, even though white can capture, now after d6, if we look at this variation again, bx f7, rx f7, nx f7, kx f7, it's true that white could still castle, but this file is not open. In fact, castling now would probably be bad because the queen could take the pawn on h4, and all of a sudden pushing this pawn, black seems to be doing okay. Now you might be thinking, okay, wait a second, but can't we just open the file with pawn takes? You could, but if you play pawn takes pawn, then this bishop can recapture, and it's anchored by the h5 pawn. So even if something like rook check here, the king could just safely kind of hide out in this quadrant of the board. And believe it or not, black is doing well here. Okay, and so the best move there for black was f3, when things would be roughly equal if white does not open the file. But if white doesn't open the file, then you kind of have to ask yourself, what are we doing here in the king's gambit, right? In any case, black did not find this idea of pushing the pawn to f3 and instead played queen f6. Now knight c3, holding the d4 pawn, simply developing, and after c6, he castles. So placing the rook on the f file, putting all this pressure on the f pawn, both the f pawn on f4 and the f pawn on f7. And yeah, you can, if you sort of just look here for a moment at the board, this is like a dream position for a king's gambit player. White has both knights developed, the light squared bishop is pointed at f7, white managed to castle, his king looks rather safe, and the rook is on the f file. Meanwhile, yes, black has this very nice pawn mass, which he spent a number of moves constructing, but his pieces have not really moved from the back rank, and so, the black army has yet to be deployed. Okay, which makes this move queen takes h4 maybe even more questionable. You think like you want to try to figure out how to deploy this knight. I'm not even sure. Knight e6, knight c7 might be one idea. In any case, after queen takes pawn, now comes rook takes f4, opening the f-file and putting considerable pressure on f7. His opponent plays knight h6, a logical move, defending this f7 pawn, holding on to that square. And Alekhine simply brings another piece to attack down the f-file. So now he has 1, 2, 3, 4 pieces all converging on the focal point f7. Black races back to try and defend, and f7 is adequately defended at the moment. It's attacked and defended 4 times each. But Alekhine has a really nice move here, a move that kind of just presses black. Rook f6. Here, it's hard to find a good move for black, and honestly, that's because there's not one. White has a commanding position. This knight is in trouble, and of course, the pressure on f7 is mounting and cannot really be solved. The fact that black did not develop the queen side in the game makes this attack very effective. Okay, d6 is played. Attacking the knight, but also maybe hoping to bring the bishop out to e6 to try and defend f7. And here, a very strong move. What would you play here if you were playing with white? So you might be tempted to move the knight to safety, since this pawn move does attack the knight. But retreating now would give black the ability to catch up with development with something like knight d7, attacking your rook, and if your rook runs away, then black starts to do okay with something like g3, and he's got this g4 square for his knight all of a sudden. So retreating is not sufficient. Of course, taking on f7 is not quite correct either. Black can simply take back with the rook, and even if bishop takes rook, now knight takes, and if we look, okay, white retains this pressure down the file. However, it's not clear how he can really continue to add pressure. For instance, the g5 square is now covered by this knight, so the bishop can't really come into the attack. The same is true for h6. Something like bishop e3, looking to play maybe queen f2 and rook h1 is very, very slow and gives black time to play knight d7, attacking the rook, pushing the rook away, and, okay, certain dilemmas we've already seen before. g3, for instance. Okay. So in this position back here, after black plays d6, Alekhine decided to leave the knight on its square e5 and instead bring another piece to the attack, bishop g5. You'll notice the bishop is pointed at the queen through the rook, which introduces all kinds of tactical possibilities. And in the game, black did not like that and ran away with queen c7, removing their queen from the line of fire. Now you might wonder, why not just pawn takes knight? Well, pawn takes knight is, honestly, probably it's the best move that black has, but it's still not good enough because we have this idea of rook takes h6 with a double threat. Our rook is threatening the rook on h7, and our bishop is threatening the queen. So for instance, if queen takes bishop, we have, of course, rook takes rook, and now the pressure on f7 is really something. And if instead they were to play rook takes rook, well, I'm not going to capture the rook. Of course, I'm going to take the queen. And again, the pressure on f7 from my queen and bishop now is insurmountable, indefensible, I should say. In any case, after bishop g5, black did not take the knight and instead played queen c7. Here, Alekhine decides to remove one of the defenders of the focal point f7 by playing bishop takes knight. So one less defender on f7, and also grabbing a piece, so with tempo. Here, black decided to remove one of the attackers of f7. Rather than capture back on h6, black captured the knight on e5 in the middle of the board that was causing such a headache. But this is still insufficient because after bishop takes bishop and king takes, simply pawn takes pawn, and now there is an additional attacking resource, one that Alekhine was fond of using, a far advanced pawn. This pawn now has the ability to become another attacker on the f7 square by simply advancing to e6. All right, and so here black decided to play queen e7, putting the queen back where it was previously. I think the idea was that black was hoping to prevent pawn e6, thinking, okay, if I can defend this square with my queen and my bishop, then the pawn cannot advance there. You know, you might wonder, why not just bishop e6 right away to kind of blockade that square? Well, that would fail for a tactical reason. See if you can spot why. Well, I could just play rook takes bishop, although even bishop takes is probably stronger. This keeps everything pointed at f7. The idea is that the pawn is not actually defending that square because there is a pin against black's king. And so the move queen e7, okay, is understandable. However, Alekhine played e6 anyway. That's right. This move did not actually prevent the pawn coming crashing through on the e6 square. Black, of course, is unable to play pawn takes pawn for the same reason. Black could not capture a piece on that square. The f-pawn is pinned. And so here, black tried to finally develop the queen side with knight a6. But after pawn takes pawn, knight c7, white's attack is simply too much. See if you can find the little maneuver that Alekhine used to finish off his opponent here in this correspondence game. He came up with this really nice idea, simply playing rook g6, and the threat is to make a Damiano's mate with rook g8 checkmate. So after rook g6, black does not have a lot of great options. Rook g8 checkmate is threatened. He played rook g7 to try to forestall the inevitable, but now simply rook h6. The threat is renewed. If rook h8, rook g8, rook takes rook we would have Damiano's mate again. So here black removed this pawn, which was creating the mate threat. However, after bishop takes, black cannot recapture the bishop. Why not? What would white do if black were to capture the bishop? Well, Alekhine for sure would have played rook f6, just pinning the queen to the king, with our rook supported by our queen. If queen takes rook, then queen takes queen, and okay, white's winning here rather easily. And so queen takes bishop was not an option. Queen takes bishop was not an option. And instead, he played the move bishop d7. The idea here, well, to try and develop, of course. Maybe also freeing the rook to try to defend along the 8th rank. However, now comes this killer move, rook h7. There were many winning moves there, but rook h7 is a particularly nice one. A couple big threats here, but well, let's just say if the bishop moves, it's a check and we're attacking the queen. So black could play queen c5 check to try to slow things down and save their queen, but after king h1, all the threats are still there. There is no defense. I mean, even if the rook steps over, simply bishop e6 is a crushing check. There is no escape for the king. If he steps forward to, oh wait, the entire 7th rank is cut off by the rook. What am I saying? If he steps to the only square he has available, then queen f7 is simply made. All right, I thought this was a really interesting game. I hope you guys enjoyed it as much as I did.